Welcome to Packets and Bolts podcast about technology, life, philosophy, and everything in between. It is Thursday, February 20th, 2025. This is your host, Muskrat, flying solo tonight as I interview Matt Emery. Matt Emery owns the websites Leedskalnin.com and MagneticUniverse.com, dedicated to Ed Leedskalnin, who created the Coral Castle. He also had interesting theories of magnetism, gravity, and all manner of subjects. Email the show, packetsandbolts@gmail.com, packetsandbolts@gmail.com. Join us on Discord, Mastodon. I think we're on Blue Sky now as well. All right, as I said, no Mongoose or Dubstench tonight. I am going to be joined by our guest soon here. No news, news stories or anything, although there's a lot happening in the news, as you are well aware, I'm sure. I am enjoying currently Samuel Smith Imperial Stout. That's right. This stuff is pretty good. I think I've had it on the show before, but if you ever get a chance to try one, if you could get it on draft, that would be even better. But I've got it in bottles. It's good stuff. Yeah. I think they claim that the I think it's made in stone. What do they call it? Stone casks, or brewed in something like that. Let me look that up right now. Samuel Smith Imperial Stout. I recently also came upon their holiday ale or something to that effect. It was interesting as well. Not as good as the Imperial Stout. I also like their, the Toddy Porter. I think that's it. I know Mongoose does not like that, but all right, let's see here. Samuel Smith. If I could find their, there's their brewery page. All right, Imperial Stout. Let's see here. Well, I do not see. Fermented in stone Yorkshire squares. So, I don't know. That must be a thing. If I were to start brewing beer, maybe I'd have to get stone Yorkshire squares. I don't know if that's a thing, but I assume it is. It's got to be a thing, right? All right. Well, it is quite delicious. Other than that, it's been a week. Lots of busy, and we have not had time to get another episode with all of the cast and crew. But I was able to reach out to Matt Emery. I think it was last week I started reaching out and got contact with them. And Leedskalnin.com and MagneticUniverse.com, both great websites if you wish to pursue your knowledge of Ed Leedskalnin. Amazing subject. And we will get to the guest here in 2 seconds. Let me take one more sip of this beer because it's amazing. Yeah. Trust me, you're going to like this. Samuel Smith, Imperial Stout. All right, let's get to the interview here and welcome our guest. All right, Matt, thanks for joining the Packets and Bolts podcast. How are you doing this evening?
Great. Thanks for having me. How you doing?
Good. Yeah, I was perusing the Leedskalnin, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Leedskalnin .com website. What was it?
Leedskalnin.
Leedskalnin.com website, and I did find some of your different articles on there, and the forum, the Magnetic Universe, and that led me through the perpetual motion holder, which I am aware of, and I've actually tried, and it's an interesting device. And then is it the light machine or the best machine, I think you called it?
Yes. He actually made 10 different machines to for the most efficient way to produce electricity, and his best machine um, made all kinds of light. So I kind of coined it the light machine from that.
Sure. Yeah, and yeah, the website's very interesting, and it's been around for a while. Would you like to give a little bit of background about what you know about Ed, how you got interested in him, and the website itself?
Sure, sure. It started, I think, right around uh, 2000. I was at Purdue University, and I took the history of science and technology class, and we were challenged with we could write a paper as our final project, or we could build something. We had actually just finished up a section on the perpetuum mobile, or the efforts made throughout the centuries to kind of that different scientists had gone through to make a perpetual motion machine. So I chose to build a device, and had recalled reading about Ed Leedskalnin and his perpetual motion holder that he had written about in his writings. But before I got to his writings, I learned about him. I think it was a Leonard Nimoy hosted Nova special from the early '70s. He had done a segment on Ed Leedskalnin and what they call now the Coral Castle. So it was fascinating that this guy who's barely 100 pounds, a Latvian immigrant, he was born in 1887, made his way to the U.S. By ship. I think he first went to Oregon, bought property there, worked in the lumber trade, and as a laborer, made his way across the country. Ultimately, ended up in Florida, Homestead, Florida, the kind of the southern tip, just south of Miami. Coincidentally, on one of the vertices of the Bermuda Triangle.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's another fascinating note with this guy, since his he wrote the book Magnetic Current. So he made his way to Florida and was very ill. A guy by the name of Moser took him in and kind of nursed him. He and his wife nursed him back to health, and ultimately sold him a patch of land where he started quarrying stone there, and slowly started building, quarrying and erecting large stones and sculpting them into various shapes. He The Mosers died, and before they died, he bought more land. Um, let's see. They were going to build a subdivision next to his property, and he filed a complaint. Within weeks, some thugs showed up to his property and beat him up really bad. He was hospitalized for nearly a month.
Oh, wow.
So he moved the entire castle. And at that time, all of his stones the perimeter stones on the castle weigh in between 9 and 13 tons. But he loaded all these up. He would never, no one ever witnessed him allow someone to give him any help whatsoever. He refused all help. He wanted to do everything on his own. But he loaded up on a truck with solid rubber wheels, and slowly moved the castle to a new location. At that time, it was called Ed's Place. When he moved it just outside of Homestead, he changed the name to Rock Gate. And then he continued working on it from about 1923. I think he finished in about 1936. And ultimately grew into this magnificent coral structure that no one could believe one man was able to single-handedly build this structure. So there's multiple stones there that are really fascinating. So if you're ever in southern Florida, you should stop by and check it out. There's I think the heaviest structure is 60,000 pounds. Wow. Or 30 ton. He's got about a 40-foot telescope that I think goes nearly 20 feet in the ground. He has a huge five-pointed star, and then he's got other structures like a Saturn structure and some other kind of astronomical structures. He built his own sundial that was precise within seconds.
Hmm.
But in about once it was built, and he was a fascinating guy. He charged 10 cents to get in. Once it was built, he set out to do his own, which most people don't really know about until they dig deep into it. And I think in the late 90s, when I first got Ethernet, I decided to look this guy up after seeing the special when I was a kid and realized that he had written several books or pamphlets on what he called magnetic current. So it was his own theory of electromagnetism. And it was, rather than being based on electrons and protons and those kinds of things, he called it the North and South Pole magnets. And throughout his, let's see, three of his writings, he actually took out newspaper ads and posted them in the newspaper before, publish them in paperback.
Really?
Yeah. So he's got magnetic current, and then he has mineral, animal, and vegetable life.
Mm-hmm.
He's got one called magnetic base, and he has one just called advertisement. And all of those four speak about his experimentation with magnets at Rock Gate that he did over a 2-year period. And the fifth book is his views on politics, domestic life, things like that. And it's an interesting book. A lot of people think that may be written in code. So he also talks about his Sweet 16, which is the supposed reason he built the castle is his lost love, Agnes Scuzz, who left him at the altar and broke his heart. That was not her real name. That's the name. Her real name was Hermione.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. So he also built a very deep well there. He built an enormous table shaped the size of Florida.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that.
The lake in the middle. I mean, in the for one single man to this, it defies everything we know. He also had claimed to know the secrets of the pyramids and the Egyptian pyramids and those built in the Yucatan as well. So it's probably the only modern. I would say it is the only modern man-made megalithic structure that there is. Mm-hmm. And for one man to do it, I like to say he's the strongest man who ever lived. Yeah. He has to be. It's the greatest single human accomplishment of all time that's documented. I mean, that you can go to and see today, that no one man has ever accomplished a physical feat that great.
Yeah, and the carrying of the stones is one thing, but does anyone know, because he quarried them too, does anyone have documentation of how he did that part?
Yeah, there's some footage, archive.org. Mm-hmm. There is some footage that's slowly surfaced over the years, at least the 20 years I've been researching it. And there's some anchors around the place, but his hoist was rated at 10 tons.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and his tripods were 40 feet tall. Mm-hmm. Miami Dade pine. So this is in Dade County, Miami. Just raising the tripod itself for one man to do is a feat in itself. Right. But there is some footage that shows him ratcheting some stones and lifting some of the smaller stones, but the bigger stones he did at night. He didn't want anyone to, yeah.
But what about cutting them? Like what did he use to actually, get them into shape? Like, did anyone see that?
He I think there were some affidavits of folks that did see him doing some of that work, but he used, after he died, a group of people came together because no one could believe that he did this alone.
Mm-hmm.
And they, and they're available somewhere. It's been a while since I've looked at them, but these folks that were kids that later had written affidavits testifying to the fact that he worked at night, he worked alone,
Wow.
and no one ever helped him. But he used leaf springs and he pounded them in, and that's how he broke them loose.
Really?
And then he used those giant tripods, which are a mystery in themselves. There's on top of the tripods, and some of the pictures, he had 3 of them. And like I said, they're 9-inch diameter poles, 40 feet tall. And then on top was a box. Right. So the box is very mysterious. Is there some sort of electronic device in there, a magnetic device that lessen the weight of the stones?
Sure.
Those kinds of things.
Well, the interesting thing about the people that say that it was just leverage and stuff, right? Like, so let's say you could raise the stone, like on this tripod. You still have to move it to another. The tripod doesn't get you to move it around. Think about, like, how would you actually get all these things onto a truck and move them miles away? And if you're doing it by yourself, that seems a little, interesting. So I always thought it was funny when the skeptics or whatever would say, well, he claimed he just knew leverage really well. Okay. So, seems a little beyond the person.
It's interesting, and we can get to the more of the mystical aspect of it a little bit later. But I think common techniques, like, so when you move giant stones, say in a cemetery, you put down rollers, and you can use a come along and pull them across rollers and things like that. Mm-hmm. But like you said, I mean, when you're talking tonnage, 10 tons, did I mention he had a spinning gate that was 10 tons that a child could push with a finger? And there's video footage of kids pushing this, barely touching this 10-ton gate. Mm-hmm. And it's perfectly when you watch like Ancient Aliens or some of these things, you always say, oh, there's the precision in that gap between the stones. There's no way that was made without high technology.
Right.
Well, the gate, when closed, was at that level where the seams between the gate and the surrounding wall, you could barely fit a piece of paper through it. It was hairline.
No, that does not work anymore because modern engineers tried to figure it out, right? Is that what happened?
As of in 1986, they did fix it.
Oh, really?
But they couldn't get it back right, so they had to remove. It was no longer, that super tight fit. Okay. They had to take some off around the edges and things like that to get it to work. And I forget what type of bearing he used, but he used the old car parts for a lot of things.
Right.
And soft iron, which is hard to get today. So and when we talk about his perpetual motion holder, if you go to make them, you can get cold rolled steel and things like that work, but to find that type of iron from the 30s and 40s that you would have better results, so to speak, with some of his experiments, you just can't get.
Interesting.
Let's see. His writing, there's so many fascinating aspects to his writings. So that's I call it double helical magnetic interaction, because what he demonstrates in his experiments is that in a current carrying wire, there's always 2 forces present, and they run against each other, he says, in whirling right-hand twists. So they essentially collide and then interact double helically. He doesn't use that term because that term wasn't around back then, but and he has experiments to prove it. I'm not, as a tech guy, you may have heard of X-ray diffraction, where you hit subatomic particles with an X-ray, and then scientists reverse and do the math to figure out what the actual structure is based on the displacement of those X-rays. Similarly, he has an experiment. It's actually, I think it's on the homepage of my website, where you hang north and south pole magnets all the way down a wire and run DC through it, DC current, and they'll displace or diffract or deflect, however you want to put it, in opposite directions, all the way down the wire as tight as you want to put them. He used tiny needles to test the polarity of things and to do most of his experiments. So you magnetize tiny needles, and then you could test the polarity of all these things. So, really? But that particular experiment, after you read his writings numerous times, you realize he's talking about a double helical structure. And I actually demonstrate it with notebook helixes on, say, a wooden dowel or something like that. Mm-hmm. And you can see how they screw together. And then if you pull on them and create tension, it represents voltage. Okay. And if you loosen them up, and they work harder to move forward. It's fascinating. So, the ultimate conclusion I came to was that based on all of his writings, and I didn't veer from anything he said. That way I could always say, hey, this is what the guy said. That way I can't get beat up for some of these things. Mm-hmm. But so if they're moving in the same direction, they're the same polarity. If they're moving in opposite directions, that's when they attract and they want to screw together. I don't know if obviously you've played around with magnets, and if they're powerful, they really want to come together. Yeah. But if they're the same polarity, they push apart. So, and then what happens if you break a magnet? You can never put it back together. And it makes sense if you look at the helixes. If you cut one of the helixes, when you attempt to screw them together, you can't, because they're going the same direction. So with a magnet, it's the same concept. You can never fit it back together because it's still flowing in that direction and therefore repels. Okay. And it applies to his theory of gravity as well, which I think is pretty phenomenal, since we don't really have one right currently. So his makes a lot of sense. And
I was reading some of the I think it was on the forum, I think, like the hidden pages, I believe. He actually brought the magnetism aspect to even chemical battery, which I had not seen him write about before. The other thing, and we can get into that if you want, but the other thing, just in general, I think you kind of brushed over in the beginning of your discussion. His idea on magnetism is really different than what most what the modern, I don't even know if we can really point to what the modern concept of magnetism is, but most of the time if they talk about a magnetic field, it's probably seen as like a static field. But he really talked about magnetic current, like you said, right? So he thought of magnetism as actually flowing, which most of I don't really hear scientists talk like that. And most people, the perpetual motion holder is a variation of the electromagnet. So if you take like a nail that's not magnetic and you wrap a coil around and put current through it becomes magnetic. You turn the current off, it stops being magnetic, right? And what his is basically you take like a U magnet or not a magnet, but a U-shaped piece of metal, right? It could be non-magnetic. And I think it's two counter-rotating coils. Is that how it is? If I remember correctly.
They're both wound with a right-hand twist.
Okay. Yep.
It'll actually, you can actually make it work with one coil, but it's a dead short. And what it'll do is lock that bar on permanently with tremendous force. He said he locked his in that state, and you can hang the weight of it, which is a full-size version is about 25 pounds from so essentially it's that U magnet that you mentioned, and it's 1.5 inches square. The prongs are 12 inches long, and then the U at the bottom is 3 inches, so 15 inches long, and then with the U and a half, or inch and a half bar on top is 16 and a half inches. So it's really large and heavy. You put the bar on, split second charge, it'll lock that bar on indefinitely until you get it off. So he let it sit for 6 months. I let it sit actually for over 2 years.
Oh yeah.
My original. So that's what going back to how I got into it. So I had that device machined out of cold rolled steel when I was a student, and set up the experiment in my professor's office. Charged it, wired the light bulb off, yanked the bar off, showed him the intensity of the light or the amount of light in the light bulb. So essentially, in layman's terms, when you yank the bar off, that energy that's circulating, and he claims it's circulating in that, it's not static.
Right.
It comes back out, at least a portion of it, back through the coils and lights a light bulb up. So I set the experiment up, showed him how much would come out when you yanked the bar off, recharged it, set it up, left it in his office for 2 weeks, went back, and we pulled the bar off, and it had the same intensity as it did first time. So that's essentially the complete experiment. He's got numerous experiments with that device, including the best machine we talked about. He also talks about, with that device, how you can show if you add magnets to a thing, it can act like a living thing. So if you hang those tiny polarized needles over that device, it will displace them, like I mentioned in the how he demonstrates that double helical action of DC current initially. So it'll displace those tiny needles just barely, and to him that proves that there's actual motion inside the bar. But
you mean when it's doing its thing of being sealed up?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
Really interesting. Do you know what scientists say? Like I think I've read maybe one article from a scientist that said it's not perpetual and it would eventually just fall apart. But other than that, I haven't really heard of an explanation of why it operates the way it does. Have you heard of what the mainstream says about it, or do they just ignore it?
You don't want to. It shouldn't even retain that energy. Period. Once it's removed from the magnetic field, you shouldn't be able to. The bar should just fall right off. It's cold rolled steel. It's not a permanent magnet. And that's the other thing. When you yank the bar off, there's barely any residual magnetism whatsoever. It's all gone. So that releases it. But when you charge it, it's essentially a real working flux capacitor. So I should have marketed it like that. But the president of Purdue University was interested at the time, and this was back in, I think, 2002. Yeah, 2002. So I went to physics first, and they claimed that the coils were picking up ambient energy from the power lines.
Okay.
So I unwound the coils to prove them, and the bar stayed on it after I unwound the coils.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you took them off.
So they claimed, yeah. And then, I'm sorry, that was double E. The double E guy said that. So then they had me take it to the fit, because my degree's in English, not electronics or physics or anything like that. So took it to physics, and there was a professor that was interested in the effects and knew that there was something there that had yet to really been realized. And we worked on it. He wrote up a proposal and sent it back to the president's office, and they said, well, we don't have any funding for it. So they really just ignored it. And especially I don't think it can be explained with modern EM theory.
Right. Yeah, especially with like electrons and what the way we think of modern science thinks of physics.
Here's what Leedskalnin says about the electron. I thought I had it handy here. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
And I probably have it memorized, but just in case.
Yeah, I know that Tesla and others were not in the same realm as what we call electrons today. They had a different view.
So he says he calls it his imaginary baby or an imaginary baby. He said Thompson invented an imaginary baby and called it an electron. Rutherford adopted it, and now the men with long hair are nursing it. The electron has a brother, and its name is proton, but it's heavy and lazy. It remains stationary in the middle, but the electron has to run around it. So he challenged modern theory from a lot of different standpoints.
Right.
Throughout there, there's a lot of stuff we could talk about, I guess.
Yeah.
But that device. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. You're talking about the perpetual motion holder.
Yeah. Since we're on that subject, and we talked about his best machine or the light machine, he said he made 10 different devices to see what the most efficient way to make electricity was. And he said his magnetic current works the same as electric current. And I want to talk about back up and talk about magnetic current in a second. But first, he said, so I mentioned he has over 50 experiments to prove his theories. He has one where you use the perpetual motion holder and you move a smaller coil through the prongs. And he demonstrates that you get, and he has that smaller coil, it's like a pickup coil attached to a light bulb. As you move it through with a core, an iron core, it'll light up on the way in and the way out. Okay. So he uses that device to demonstrate how AC works, which he calls natural. DC is not a natural phenomenon. You've got to make a commutator or something like that to get DC. Oh, okay. So he uses the perpetual motion holder to demonstrate that. And his best machine is essentially that, those small coils going through those prongs and then pulsed at the moment each coil. So he says, imagine many coils on a wheel, you'll make all kinds of light. And then he goes on to say that, and you'll have to read his writings to get the exact wording, but he goes on to say that I made 10 different machines. This is the most efficient way I found to make electricity. But when he talks about magnetic current, he's not specifically referring to electricity. He's not calling it that. In fact, if it were up to him, he would call it magneticity versus electricity, because that shows that it has a magnetic base. So magnetism is always the base of electricity and not vice versa, right, from his perspective.
Yeah. That makes sense, though.
Here's an easy way you can demonstrate his magnetic current. If you take a 1/4-inch copper rod. So he has you do all these things. You build a box and you can do all these different experiments. But if you put DC on both ends of it, and then you lay across that copper wire a piece of iron wire or steel fishing wire, is what most of the experiments utilize. So they used to make fishing wire out of, I don't know if you knew that, but they used to make fishing wire out of steel, and I think they might still do that, actually. And it's really small and flexible. Sure. So you lay, say, an 8-inch piece across the 18-inch piece of copper wire, run the DC through. It throws the magnets off in opposite directions, which is the base of his double helical theory of, how electricity flows in a wire. Then you can take that and dip it in iron filings, and it'll be magnetized. So he challenges you to see how long you can make a magnet. So that magnetic current runs down that wire. So you'd have to experiment with to see how far you could get it to go on with that setup.
Hmm.
So it's not very efficient. You're just laying a copper wire across it. So it's very similar to the perpetual motion holder. So you're if you were to unbend that U shape, you can actually charge the perpetual motion holder with one coil and still light up a light bulb. If
Okay.
once you get good at building them. So if you bend that out and you've got a 3 foot piece of inch and a half square rod and you put the coil in the middle, it'll do the very same thing.
Hmm.
It'll polarize each end. But what he did with that, whether he wrapped, say, so he claimed that in the northern hemisphere, South Pole magnets go up and North Pole magnets come down, and the opposite's true in the southern hemisphere.
Okay.
So was he able to lessen the weight of these stones by and he actually you can demonstrate that fact as well using the iron filings and some tin. How much more South Pole magnets push up than North Pole magnets in the northern hemisphere.
Really?
So yeah, South Pole magnets come out of the positive terminal of a car battery. I feel like I'm just regurgitating. I haven't talked about this stuff in years,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'm just whatever's popping into my head is just kind of just coming out right now. But um, so there's so much mystique around these different strange magnetic things that he's doing. Did he make a long wire? And I think Tesla said, if I want to move something heavy, all I do is wrap one coil around it. That quote's out there somewhere. So there's something that's missing,
Right.
that people haven't or forgot or haven't figured out.
Yeah.
I mean, he knew the secrets of the Yucatan and the pyramid builders. So I don't, and there is you can see it in hieroglyphs, the perpetual motion holder
Oh, really?
or some,
Something
but
that looks like it.
well, I mean, it's a giant tuning fork, so maybe, but it shows it with kind of wires going across it and things like that. But
Interesting. I'll have to look for that. The best machine. So yeah, you were talking about that. Basically it looks like where you've got the spinning part of like let's say a motor, right? He's putting coils in that inside part, right?
correct,
Just a
yeah.
wheel filled with coils basically, and it's spinning against other coils on the outside of that. Or I'm trying to find the picture on your.
It's essentially just going through the prongs. So it would have to be you would have to be very precise. So you would go the prongs were horizontal, and then you had a wheel going through those prongs horizontally with the horizontal coils. So, um, so that gap in between those prongs is 3 inches. So you would have something slightly less than 3 inches attached to a wheel, and many of them on a wheel going through those prongs, and then you would get the initial, and then you would get the back EMF or whatever you want to call that, which normally hinders motors, but in his case, he utilized that. It's energy, so why not use it? So,
Really, he's
which,
using the force that would usually fight against
yeah,
the. Really
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, from the way it reads. So, um,
Sure.
I've yet to build that machine. I'd, I'd like to. I mean, somebody I think will at some point. I know there were people working on it.
Yeah.
I think we discussed.
So I found the picture on your site, and so it's basically like, okay, so it's the U part of the perpetual motion holder with the two coils on the U magnet, or well, U, it's not a magnet, right? It's just a U piece of steel or something.
Yeah,
And then the wheel is between that with the horizontal. So those coils aren't even overlapping the other coils, according to this diagram. I don't know if this is
no,
official schematic.
no. That's the other thing. And I see this a lot, but from my experience in building these things, and I've built a lot of them, um, he tells you specifically to put those coils as close to the bottom of the U as possible because you got to give that energy a chance to polarize.
Okay.
So if you've got a coil that takes up your entire prong, it's going to be less efficient than a smaller coil. Essentially, the rule I go by is the coil should be half as long as of your prong.
Okay.
So in whatever device I build. So
and this does take, according to what I was reading, it does take an electrical input, but he claims that this or some sort of input, but he claims this is a more efficient way of creating electricity than our current or the generators of the time, is what he was saying, right? Or
yeah.
Okay. And this is a different version than the big wheel he had horizontally mounted, which people have speculated what that does.
Yes.
Yeah. What can you speak
That's
to
his
that?
generator. Yeah, that he made utilizing Model T V magnets from the magnetos in those engines. And there was it's polarized north south all the way around it. So he cemented that all together and made a kind of like a very heavy wheel that was able to sustain some momentum. And he put it atop a crankcase, I think from a Model T.
Right.
It still works today. It's unbelievable.
What does it do? Does it just generate energy?
So after he died, all the components that were around it got taken.
Really?
So, yeah. And there was, in his pictures that he includes in his writings, there's a little black box. And he's got all this extra iron attached to it, chains and hoists and all these things. Because he was a big, I don't know if you've ever messed around with a coil without an iron core. You don't get much magnetism, but once you put that iron core is it draws in more of the magnetism than. That's the other thing. What you can kind of glean from, I think, modern theory. This, I don't know if you've heard of 0 point energy with the kind of the free energy lingo.
Sure. Yep.
I don't really know what that is because it all comes from the Earth's magnetic field. Sure. There's not an unlimited supply of electrons in copper wire.
Mm-hmm.
You're extracting. All generators do the same thing. They extract electrons, or in his case, magnets, from the Earth's magnetic field. There's nowhere else for it to come from. So,
sure.
So he figured out the most efficient way to extract that energy from the Earth's magnetic field. So, but again, I'm not a scientist or a physicist, so it's just just a normal guy is going to kind of come to understand from experimenting with this stuff.
So do you think that all those things that were taken just because people took it, or do you think there was something more, like Tesla when he, the FBI came and confiscated stuff? Do you think it was like that, or just people taking things because it was passed away?
Well, he did get visited by the FBI because he started researching Tesla and he started building these aerial arrays. And some people testified that he had a grid. This was after he built the castle. So some of these things he wasn't doing to build the castle, but he had all these aerials set up, and you could see his radio in the workshop. He had a crystal radio, and he may have been transmitting power at that time because Tesla was writing about what he was doing as well. And there were other affidavits that, he couldn't wait to get his scientific magazines and things like that. But I think he was paying close attention to what Marconi and Tesla and those guys were doing. But that reminds me, I did replicate a motor, a Tesla patent that I think was never realized about 8 or 9 years ago. And it was Tesla patent 464666. So I called it the Demon Motor. What drew me to it, the design, is it was very Leedskalnin-esque. Um, Ultimately, it's essentially an electrical resonance motor, um, with a capacitor. To get the resonance, you've got to have like an inline capacitor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why it was never built, but I actually made this thing with a hand grinder, and uh, it was almost able to replicate it perfectly. But then I put a lead skull and spin on it and just used DC, and it was so interesting with just DC um, that back EMF thing was very prominent, and it could be utilized. But I don't. Have you ever heard of a pulse width modulator?
Yeah. Yep.
And these guys are using them to like bust apart water to get hydrogen and those kinds of things. But they make them with a fair amount of amperage now. So I was able to time this thing with the pulse width modulator,
Hmm.
and but it was uh, so I don't want to say those guys were contemporaries or what. Obviously, I'm a hack in those things, but Leedskalnin, I think, was more scientifically minded. He didn't have the education at that time, but people talk about him being a recluse and undereducated, had a fourth grade education, but none of that's true. He was a showman. Um, he was very, very well read.
Hmm.
If you read through his writings, there's no grammatical errors, there's no spelling errors. His sentence structure is fine, all those kinds of things. So, uh, but that that motor was similar to the best
Yeah.
machine, but it's
I'm looking at it right
nowhere.
now.
Oh, you found
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. Four
Some,
464 666, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
The coils are around a circle, but it's inward facing instead of outward.
right,
Like, yeah. And they're vertical instead of horizontal, it looks like.
yeah. But
Yeah. Interesting.
it was you can. I did sell that. Some guy wanted it and bought it. So, um, but I kind of wish I never sold it. It was the coolest thing.
So,
There was
you're saying that so Tesla's invention was AC, but Ed had made a DC version, or you'd made a DC version?
I made a DC version because
Okay.
that's all my experience was with DC except for Ed's experiments with AC. So which he claimed, AC's natural. He claimed that the reason why power lines can carry a current so far is because uh, magnets are filling up the lines from the Earth's magnetic field.
Mm-hmm.
So they're already there. So there's no gap that you've got to push or, he,
Sure.
what else did he say? Well, he said a lot. But he doesn't mention Tesla in all of his writings. He doesn't mention any of his construction techniques on the castle.
Sure.
So but he does, there's a few other things if we want to veer away from that tech
Mm-hmm.
aspect
Sure.
a little bit. Um, he does subtly talk about telepathy and telekinesis.
Really?
Yeah. Yep. So he says that he can chew away. He talks about vision and how your eyes work. He says they act like broadcasting cameras. They send out magnets, your eyeballs send out these magnets, and then they receive the opposite back, and then your lens flips it around. Um, but then he goes on to say that he can shoo away mosquitoes by giving them a sharp glance. So
Yeah.
like hitting him with his laser eyes.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and then he also says, how's he put it? We would all think loud if we weren't suppressed when we were young.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Now the vision shooting out is a theme. Some people argue that with various theories, but kind of going to the mysticism side, which I'm not saying that that's what Ed was. If if you're saying Ed's saying it's magnetism, but some of the mystics would say that it is, I don't know, an active vision is an active thing where we're actually, I don't know what they would call it. I don't know what the term they would use for it, but that we're actually shooting something out to some extent, instead of it just being a passive light receiving thing. So that's interesting that he thought that as well, or he's put his magnetic twist on it. But yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Is that what he thought? So you talked about telepathy. Is that also in the same kind of vein where you could pick up on those kinds of transmissions? Is that what he was getting at?
Yeah, I think so. With think loud. That's what I gleaned from it, at least. Mm. What he meant by we would all think loud if we weren't suppressed when we were young. So just subtle little things that he said that kind of deepened the mystery with this guy. Yeah, he definitely knew how to create a lasting mystery. Right. And lasting. He died in 1951, and here we are, 2025.
Yeah.
So essentially, the South Pole magnet's an electron, North Pole magnet's a proton. South Pole magnets are negative, North Pole magnets are positive. And then gravity, he's got a couple of experiments. Well, first, here's what he says gravity is. He said, in I think 1936, there's a substance in the earth, maybe I can pull it up here, more dense and more concentrated than uranium. And that's another thing. He experimented with radium, all the acid, hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, all those kinds of things. But he said it's more dense and more concentrated than uranium. Actually, I just found. Okay. Here's specifically what he says. When uranium atoms burst, they release the north and south pole individual magnets that held the atom together. Then the magnets scatter all around. They can only pass from the middle to the outside, like rays. So they're kind of like the sun. So whereas electromagnetism is circulatory, it wants to circulate. Rays or gravity goes in one direction. So from the center out. So he says, when uranium atoms burst, I think I just read that part. The north and south pole individual magnets that held the atom together, then the magnets scatter all around. They can only pass from the middle to the outside. When the north and south pole magnets are running alongside each other and in the same direction, they have no attraction for the other kind. Like I mentioned earlier, if they're running in the same direction, they're the same polarity. That's the definition of polarity. So they just bump into each other and push the one ahead of it. They only attract if they're running one kind against the other kind. When the magnets are running out of the middle of the earth, as soon as they meet an object, they attract it, on account of the fact that in any object there is both kinds of magnets. And this is where he gives an experiment on how you can demonstrate it to yourself. It can be seen by rubbing hard rubber or glass until they get hot. Then they will attract sand, iron, salt, and many other things. So essentially, you can make a magnet that'll attract something that's non-ferric because of this. So it doesn't have to be nickel, cadmium, or iron. It'll attract many different things.
Yeah.
Just like gravity.
Like gravity, yeah. Yeah, interesting.
To see how it functions, move a salt crystal a little. If it happens to get on a different magnetic pole, then it will jump away. Another way is to rub hard rubber until it gets hot. Then it will be a temporary magnet. The difference between the rubber magnet and the steel magnet is both north and south poles are in the same side of the rubber magnet and the magnet that was put in it. Attract the iron filings with the rubber magnet, then approach with the steel magnet. Change the poles. Then you will see some of the filings jump away. This means the steel magnet changed the magnet poles in the iron filings, so they jump away. So it's it's painful to go through his experiments the first few times you do it because, I mean, it's detailed experimentation
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
written by this guy. So, but it's hard to challenge his results, though, I will say.
Right. Yeah, he has a lot of different things all, and I've got the magnetic is it the magnetic current book or whatever. I mean, I think I have at least two from the Coral Castle collection. But um, one question I'm wondering if you, I don't know if you know if you made any comments on this, but we're told that that like Mars doesn't have a magnetic field. Yet I believe one of his theories about how the planets orbit is magnetism with the sun, and that was something I saw recently that brought me to this webpage of yours and everything is that tablet he's got, which has like the number 21 on it or something, and it shows kind of the position of the Earth and everything. So did he ever say anything about this, like Mars, if it, magnetic field or not, and how that would affect his theories or anything?
No, nope, he didn't. But similarly, the moon.
Mm-hmm.
So, which I think you could argue that, uh, I mean, if Mars is a dead planet, then I guess the moon would be comparable. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't, yeah, there's some dynamics in these cores that, well, I think just recently the cores different than what they originally thought. It's more malleable or something along those lines. But with the moon, so he's adamant that I've actually got a page on this. He gives these tips to rocket people.
Oh yeah, yeah. I saw something about the. He said something about the reason the moon was where was it was like repelling off the Earth's magnetic field, and I think he said something about putting magnets on the rockets basically, and that was from like 50, either 50 or 51, just before his. I think he
Yeah,
passed away around 51 or something, right?
he said. He said, uh, well, the North and South Pole magnets, they are the cosmic force. I've got all of it right here. They hold together this Earth and everything on it, and they hold together the moon too. The moon's north end holds South Pole magnets the same as the Earth's north end. The moon's south end holds North Pole magnets the same as the Earth's south end. Those people who have been wondering why the moon does not come down, all they have to do is give the moon one half a turn so that the north end would be in south side and the south end in north side, and then the moon would come down. At present, the Earth and the moon have like magnet poles in the same sides, so their own magnet poles keep themselves apart. But when the poles are reversed, they will pull together.
Hmm.
Here's a good tip to the rocket people. Make the rocket's head strong North Pole magnet and the tail end strong South Pole magnet, and then shut two on the moon's north end. Then you will have better success. So I think what he means is once you get outside of um, Earth's gravity,
Mm-hmm.
You could using magnetic attraction have a more efficient space ride to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to go to make the tip the North Pole magnet and then shoot to the South Pole, you'll have a better line. That magnetic pole will help you along, I guess.
All right.
But what I think is crazy is that, I mean, clearly our poles are moving now quite rapidly. I've been wanting to check to see if the moon's getting closer, but they're moving together. So if it was like a legit pole flip, I could see the moon maybe coming down. I'm sure it's been down many times before, like you said. But with the way they're moving now, kind of moving towards each other, it doesn't seem applicable. But
Mm-hmm.
in the but it's fascinating that he says, I mean, he's adamant. So he says, at present, the Earth and the Moon have like magnet poles in the same side, so their magnet poles keep themselves apart. But when the poles are reversed, they will pull together. So he's adamant that they're going to reverse, which we
Right.
know that because they've done it so many times in the past. And So people survive.
Yeah, I don't know if a lot of people, but it sounds like a potential cataclysmic
Yeah,
event.
yeah. I would assume it's probably not pleasant, but
Yeah, because I think it was interesting because I believe what I was watching on his theory about that is after so many cycles, um, when they flip, that when the magnetic pole flips, it actually causes the Earth to then, because it'll be in repelling from the sun's magnetic field, I believe he thinks. So then that would cause the not only the magnetic pole shifting, but basically you're talking about the tilt of the Earth moving in a way that humanity is probably not used to over since the last time it happened. And I think I was reading something about maybe 40 some thousand years ago, maybe it was the last minor one or something with the pole flipping, but
I know there's something every. I don't know if you follow Ben Davidson over at Suspicious Observers or anything like that.
mm,
He track. I mean, it we're getting aurora borealis. I'm in Indiana.
mm-hmm.
Um, we've never gotten any. Clearly, our magnetic field is diminished. It's diminishing exponentially. So that's a telltale sign of a pole flip. So
That's kind of ominous.
uh, yeah, but it's going to be beautiful. Let's say because we're seeing aurora borealis here for the first time in at least 50 years that I've been around here.
Yeah,
So
last year we got a pretty strong one, and in Wisconsin, and that was from whatever solar activity was going on. It was probably the strongest I've ever seen. It looked like a vortex, and like when I looked to the south type the sky, which you would think you'd see more in the north. But it was a weird. I've never seen that at this latitude. So
yeah,
yeah, for sure.
what do you think about it?
Which part? The the
I
coming
mean,
apocalypse or the
something's going on.
Yeah, I've heard many theories. So whether you think it's the pole flipping, whether I've just heard, some of the apocalypse might just be solar activity by itself. So take any pole issue away from it. If we get a monster flare that is beyond the what was the one called that lit the
Carrington.
yeah. Even beyond that, it basically wiping out any modern society would not be able to survive it just based on what, at least how we have technology today, melting metal, that that kind of stuff where biological life would survive, but technological life would be destroyed. So I do think we're now, is it going to be our lifetimes? Maybe not that close, but I think we're coming up from a civilization aspect to our next cycle of of destruction. So I don't know what you think of the whole Graham Hancock and all that, and I think about maybe 12,000 years ago was probably the last great civilization, and the pyramids were probably built more around then than what the Egyptologists say. But I think we're probably coming up on another one of those cycles, and I don't know if it's going to be. Hope it's not when we're here, but it seems like it might be getting close.
I would agree with everything you just said. I think, but you mentioned what's fascinating about magnetism to me is that it's so small it can go through anything.
Mm-hmm.
The only way you can protect against it is by channeling that energy around it. So I mean but what gives it the ability to go through anything like that? Wood, essentially anything, unless it's a ferric, where it can circulate. It wants to circulate.
Mm-hmm.
So, like to protect your watch, it's got a magnetic circuit in there. Like say if you work in a high magnetic field environment where, there's ways you can protect, like a Faraday cage, where you can get it to circulate around something you want to protect. But to be able to, the penetrating power, I think to me, structure wise, makes me, I don't know if you've ever worked out in the shop or with a drill press, and you get a an iron filing or whatever you want to call it, a spiral, that comes off. And those things can go all the way through 3 inches or 3 layers of clothing and like drill into your leg.
Yeah.
I when I was going through this double helical thing, I thought, well, what's the simplest structure that say one of Ed's individual magnets could be to have that ability, and it would be like a helical shape, and it can also reverse direction and still be moving forward with a right hand twist.
Right.
So those are just some of the kind of the obscure thoughts I had about what one of these tiny little things that can penetrate absolutely anything.
Right.
But the structure, because it's not a sphere, but it's something. It's a particle.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And yeah, I mean, Ed is a fascinating historical figure. Like you said, the only modern megalithic structure that at least I'm aware of. I'm pretty sure that's a fact, unless someone did one, in secret.
There is a guy, Wally Wallington.
Really,
the forgotten technology was. He, you might want to check him out sometime. He poured a 20,000-pound obelisk and raised it by himself. And he also used some smaller stones to show, which I'm pretty sure Ed may have used something similar. You build these wood structures, and they look like arcs, and you roll the stone, and it rolls. You can push it with your finger, and it'll roll 10 feet like a 2-ton stone.
Oh, sure, yeah, I think I know who you're talking about. Yeah,
yeah.
He kind of built like a little POC in his on some land or something, right?
Yeah. That's the guy. Yep.
Yeah.
So I don't know, where there's a will, there's a way, I guess. But whether or not it, and one other thing is, there used to be I haven't seen people talk about it in quite a while, but they claim that Ed had a plaque that said, the secret to the universe is these certain numbers.
Really?
Well, it turns out those numbers, 610895 divided by 7129. But if you look at his immigration form, those numbers were on his immigration form. So he had them etched in the door jamb of his tower shack,
Really?
Which was about 600 tons. So that tower at the castle, all those stones combined were 600 tons.
Wow. Well, yeah, that's yeah, like I said, fascinating subject, fascinating figure. Matt, I know we're coming up past the hour here. Any other tidbits you wanted to tell us about? Your website, of course, is you have the Leedskalnin.com and the magneticuniverse.com for the forum.
One last thing, recently, so in his writings, when he's talking about the perpetual motion horror, he says, if you make this thing bigger, you will have better effects. Well, recently, someone came forward and said that when they were a kid, they found 4 enormous 4 or 5 foot, 3 to 4 inch thick perpetual motion holders buried after Ed died, right after they lived close by. And 2 9-year-old kids reported this, and the military showed up and came and cleared all the brush out and removed them.
Really?
And apparently they had glass coil cores and were wrapped with some kind of green wire, just like the perpetual motion holder. So I just read about this recently and thought it was pretty fascinating.
Where was the glass? The glass was where? And what
glass coil. So he says to use aluminum or brass for your coil cores, but aluminum should work better. But glass, though, apparently is what was on these.
Huh.
And they were enormous.
Wow.
So who knows? I mean, so I'll leave it at that. That
Yeah.
was,
Well, yeah, I mean, the mysteries keep coming.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt, for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right.
It's been a while since I've talked about this, so I wasn't sure what was all going to come out, but
All right. Well, we'll have to do it again.
yeah, sounds good. Nice talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good night.
Yep, have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. That was Matt Emery, Leedskalnin.com, magneticuniverse.com for the forum. I mean, fascinating subject. Always, the Coral Castle is something I've always been amazed by, and I definitely am going to get down there at some point in my life. It is Thursday, February 20th, 2025. Email the show, packetsandbolts@gmail.com, packetsandbolts@gmail.com. Till next time, keep packing those bolts. We'll see ya. Real goat.